time for us to talk about snapping and aligning in Blender. Now, we have a couple of different ways to go about this, one of which we've seen, and one that'll be new to us. The one we've seen is, of course, our Snap menu, which we access by hitting Control S. Now, our Snap menu is very limited, but it does do some neat things. Unfortunately, it basically deals with moving our selection to the grid or cursor, or moving our cursor to the grid or selections. Now, we've used this in the past to good effect, and it can, in very simple transforms, be incredibly speedy and very useful. However, when transforms become more complex, it can be very difficult to get the results that we want, either by having to do many more operations with the Snap menu than we would like, or it being simply impossible to accomplish with this menu. Thankfully, Blender allows us a second set of Snap tools to help us cope with those. Now, if we look down here, right next to our Layers panel, we can see a little icon that looks like a magnet. And if we turn that on, it gets red like a magnet. We know it's active. That's our Snap During Transform key. Next to that is the type of element that we're going to snap. We can choose from increment, vertex, edge, face, or volume. But what does all that mean? Well, let's start by looking at increment, the default. In increment mode, we're basically going to snap just as if we were holding down the control key on a transform, as we've done in the past. And just like it, if I hold down the shift key, I get 1/10 that transform. So, very handy, but we already have a pretty quick and easy way to access that. But what about our other choices? Well, let's take a look at a few. Let's try Vertex. And when we open Vertex, we get some options. Basically, it wants to know what our target is going to be. We can choose an active target, a median target, a center, or closest. Let's leave it on closest. Now, if I just grab my widget here and I start trying to snap this around, it can be done, and as you see, we did snap to it, but it can be a little difficult to get control, especially if you're working in a perspective mode or something like that. So it's a little bit handier to always have your cursor near the element that you want, in this case a vertex, and then hit G for our grab. And now when we move, we find that snapping two things is just a little bit easier. So that's just a little tip and trick to make life a little bit easier when you're working, and to be able to get things to snap a little more conveniently. Now, let's look at some other things. I'm going to go ahead and go from vertex to edge mode. This is where aligning comes in. Once again, I'm going to put my cursor around this edge and hit G. I'm going to bring it over. And you see our edge does align with this nearest edge, but it's not really locked there. And that's why it's called a snap and align tool. It's aligned, but it's not snapped to an exact position. We can see this even more clearly if we move this to face. Keep it at closest. And again, grab our G tool. And now we see that we're aligned perfectly with the top face of this plane. But we're not snapped to an exact location. We can place our object anywhere on this plane we like. So if I left click and finish this off, we can see that it was perfectly snapped, but the alignment allowed us some adjustment. Now, what are some of the other things we have going on? Well, we can also do things like we'll stay in face mode. We'll also stay in closest mode. This time, I'm going to hit my rotation. What this does is tells my snapping object to rotate itself to its target. So, if I grab it and move it up here around this plane, we'll see that it perfectly aligns itself along that plane. That gives you a pretty good idea of how some of the snap and align tools work in Blender. There's a great many bits and pieces that these can be mixed around to add. I would suggest trying selecting 2 of the cubes at once and using median to see what happens when you snap to certain objects. But for the most part, snapping will be a little bit hit and miss until you just practice enough to be familiar with how everything reacts. I apologize for the little jolt there. I ended this video without even talking about edit mode, so I'm not quite sure what I was thinking. But let's grab our other square. I'm going to bring this over a little bit. I'm going to turn off my snapping for a second. And let's pop into edit mode. Now, basically, everything's going to work kind of the way it did when we were in object mode. Oddly, it'll be a little bit more intuitive, I think, in edit mode than object mode, especially depending on what sub-objects you're dealing with. So if I were to go to vertex and grab this corner vertex, hit my G key, and I can pull it over here, and boom, we get an instant snap. I could do the same over here, and we get an instant snap. And you can see where doing this could help us create some very complex geometry very quickly from various objects and sub-objects. Really very handy stuff. But again, it's really going to come down to practice and thinking through ahead of time exactly what you're trying to accomplish when you're doing these things. So, I hope you will take some time to just really play around with this tool. Make a bunch of objects, go in and out of edit and object mode, and really just kind of make a mess and get used to what does what and get used to the intuitiveness of, or lack of it, of the controls. And that's really the way you're going to get handy and quick at using snaps and aligns to your advantage. Alright, on that note, and again, I apologize for that little jolt at the end, but we'll see you in the next video.